Hello everyone, this is Shantanu Boral and welcome to our session since Apex Hours. Today's session is LWC 2020, 20 tips in 20 minutes. Let me introduce myself. My name is Shantanu Boral. I'm Salesforce MVP, 32x certified professionals and a passionate developer and architect. And by role, I'm practice lead of a Concentric Catalyst. I'm also a Journey to Salesforce mentor, Kolkata developer group leader, and I'm a blogger. That's my little bit introductions. Let's go to today's topic. What we are going to cover today. Okay, so we'll not talk about only the 20 tips. We'll understand the concepts and the best practices and what we should do too as a part of adhering those best practices. So today we'll cover all these following topics, starting with UI considerations, data related operations, use of decorators, design considerations, communications, and event propagations, and finally ends with LWC security. So let's get started with UI considerations, tips 1 to 8. Tips on styling. So you know that when we work with any component, we have to adhere company branding and their design elements, right? So we can brand our LWC button, let's say lightning button, with the use of styling hooks. So styling hook uses our CSS custom properties to customize component styling and express our brand. Okay, here in this example, you can see that how a button can be styled and it can be displayed the color as a purple. To use this color, you can see that over here I have in the CSS file, it can be added under a host so that it can be host is means that it can be applied to any elements which is part of this host, right? And he can see that we have used this button brand color background as purple and brand color border as purple. How beautifully it can be expressing our brand. Let's go to the other tips on styling. So earlier we talked about the styling hooks. Here we will talk about the SLDS design tokens. Design tokens makes our CSS life simpler and easy to maintain. Here you can see that how a badge level can be given is a beautiful color. So over here in the HTML in the left hand side, we can see that lightning badge level is badge level, and in the CSS we can pass these variable under a var. Okay, now there are other way we can do the design tokens, that is called the aura tokens. You know, many of us might have the aura components, right, and aura tokens, and that can be used in our LWC component. To use that LWC component in the CSS, we have to use this var attribute hyphen C and then hyphen and my background color, and in the token name you can use your my background color and provide the value. This is the one way we can do styling. Let's move on to the rendering part of it. Okay, so there are two ways we can render a component, right? One is a declarative way and other is a programmatic way. Okay, so declarative way is useful, let's say, whenever we are displaying a component based on a conditional way of component visibility in the app builder. Let me give you an example. Let's say a component can be displayed if an user has certain assigned to a certain permission set. Okay, then only the component is visible, otherwise it is not. Okay, so to meet this requirement, we can use our app builder. We can open our app builder in the design mode and we can assign those conditional part in this app builder, and we can render this component either visible or non-visible based on the user is assigned the permission set or not. Okay, that is the one way of declarative. There is the other way, there is a programmatic way. Here we'll talk about two programmatic ways how the components can be displayed. We know that we work template if true false directive, right? To display the nested template tag to binding the data to the template. right? Let's say if a variable or the Boolean variable is true, then details will be visible. Otherwise, detail will not be visible. Okay, that's the one way you can do. There's the other way. Let's say CSS toggle through the CSS style. We can toggle the visibility. You can think about that whenever the error occurs or the exception occurs in Lightning Web Components, and we throw this error message to the user in a beautiful way with a kind of a red color or the informations icon, right? Or the kind of alert kind of stuff. That's the way the CSS style can use for the toggling this visibility. Here, the component stays alive and state is maintained. Now, this is what we have, right? So what should we do too as a part of this programmatic and declarative? So declarative rendering is preferable if the component is configured via Lightning App Builder. And the if true false is preferable to load the page faster, deferring the component creations based on certain conditions. And if you want to preload the component based on certain conditions, the CSS style is preferable. Okay. Let's move on to the next part. So lifecycle hooks. So we know that our every LWC component has their lifecycle hooks. It starts with the constructor, then connected callback, disconnected callback. It has a rendered callback, and finally it has the error callback, right? So constructor, it fires when the component is getting created. So we cannot inspect elements, attributes, or the children because it does not exist even, and we cannot inspect any elements public properties that are usually set after the component is created. Okay, so that's the best practices when we use the constructor, and what should not we do as a part in the constructor itself. Connected callback and disconnected callback when the component is inserted or removed from to into or from the DOM, right? If the components derives its internal state from properties, use the setter rather than connected callback. This is important. Okay, and use the is connected to check if the component is connected with the DOM or not. Okay, render callback, if the render callback, you know that whenever the component is connected and rendered, that time the rendered callback is getting called. So it might happens that you might face these difficulties that multiple times the rendered callback getting called. So to prevent that, use the Boolean attribute so that it can be prevented. And most important one of the aspects, that if you are using any kind of where adapter objects property, do not do this because it might fire the rendered callback again and again. So don't update where adapter object configuration property and public property of field in this method. Okay, otherwise it is difficult to handle this, the rendered callback. It actually causes the performance degradations. Tips for using custom data type in data table. So this is one of my favorite attribute. It has come last year and already this year. So let's say I have a situations that I am using the data table, and at that moment I want to display the account name, right? Account name along with the hyperlink. Or let's say I am using the case, a list of cases where a case can be list of cases can be displayed as a data table where I can have separate columns. Let's say what could be my case number, what could be my case status, and case status can be displayed in a image way, right? Let's say whenever I new, it will be green, in progress it is yellow, and escalated it will be red, and completed is kind of a separate color, right? If you have these kind of requirements, then we can implement a custom cells, and that can be done to the use of Lightning data table. Okay, so we can define the Lightning data table, and we can extend the Lightning data table, and we can use these custom types, and based on these custom types you can customize your data table. Here is an example. So now let's move on to data related operations. So here there are 4 ways we can do the data retrieval. One is that the LDS, Lightning Data Service base components, LDS where adapter, and haptics. So LDS are good when the records are loaded into the cache, and and shared across all the components. That's the beauty of LDS. And LDS also respects the sharing settings, FLS, cloud access, all the stuff. So that's the beauty of LDS. Okay. Base components are good. Let's say if you have, let's say if you want to display a model component, right? And with the use of your lightning edit form or record view form, right? That's the, we have seen that, right? So that moment we can use the base components also. It performs the client side validations using the validations rules. That's the beauty of this. And customizations with the record edit and the record view form can be done. LDS with the where adapter is good if you want to perform any business logic or create a more customized form. I'm giving an example. Let's say if you want to retrieve or the retrieve the data, or let's say if you want to save the data, right? At that moment, rather than if you want to add any kind of custom validations, right? Other than that cannot be done with the validation rules itself, right? So in that case, you can use the LDS where adapter. And Apex is good to make any kind of imperative calls, and which LDS does not even support. This is already we have. So what should we do too for these kind of guidelines? So data service, LDS data service optimizes the server calls by bulkifying and deduplicating the request. When using the get record where adapter, specify the fields instead of layout whenever is possible. If you specify the layout, means it is unnecessarily all these fields are added as a part of your process, right? And it will be slower. Use LDS where adapter and the functions, each operations in the independent transactions. So let's say if you have a requirement that the multiple operations can be done in a single transactions, that cannot be done with the LDS at that moment, think of using the Apex. And use Apex whenever you have a transactional scenarios to be handled. Second thing is that Apex data is not managed. So we must refresh data. Use get record notify change to update the cache, and Apex is good for loading list of records by criteria. Use of decorators. We all know about there are three types of decorators: API, tracked, and where. So API is good to expose the public property, communicates down to the content main hierarchy. So let's say if I want to pass the values from your parent component to child component, you can use the API decorator @API. Track observes the changes in the object's properties. Most of the variables which you are using as a part of Lightning Web Components, a track. But when I've seen that whenever we are dealing with the nested arrays, we use track right now also, where which is good for reading Salesforce data. And here, if you use the where, the data is read only. So now what should we do to API apply to the class fields and the class methods only? Public property which has been set by parent component should never reassign by child. This is one of the this is the one of the rule that ESLint already has. Okay, if the component needs to reflect internal value changes, above rule does not apply. These are exceptions. Track is good to apply on the class level fields only, where do not track dynamic properties and use that in where functions. It will call multiple times unnecessarily on every changes, and try passing object as a parameter rather than passing its values separately. Now let's talk about design considerations, tips 15 to 17. Design considerations for optimized performance. So what should we follow? UI level considerations. So we can improve our performance through the client side using LDS and the client and cache Apex method using the aura enable cacheable equal to true. So try leveraging paginations in the front end using the JavaScript array or slice functions rather than bringing the huge data on UI. To import object and the field reference, use the static schema. Let's say @Salesforce/schema rather than dynamic one. Here I'm to give an example that if you know the field, then you can use the static schema. But if you want to get those fields from the field set, then static schema does not work. Then you can think about using the dynamic way of introspecting the describe of the schema and the fields, objects and fields. Data retrieval considerations: when making your select query, specify those fields which are necessary, limit the number of rows to be written, and lazy loading the data rather than retrieving all the data using the data in the page load. Try using the offset to retrieve the metadata list, pick list values. Use the UI API functions. Few more recommendations for server calls: consider making server calls when no other options are available, and if you try to use the same data which has been retrieved earlier in the server calls, rather than making a separate calls itself. I'm giving an example. Let's say if you have a data set and you want to perform the sorting, filtering based on certain values, try using these things into the JavaScript coding itself, rather than separate way of making those data and retrieve the data in a separate calls through the use of Apex. Try using the client-side filtrations using JavaScript functions rather than making separate calls. Try using continuations for long-running server requests, long-running requests to the external web service, and to update records, use imperative Apex call or use UI API methods. Event communications: that we all know that how to create and handle events, event propagations, and communications across DOM. So we know that that a custom interface and the dispatch event, we can handle and create event that can be done both in the declarative way and as well as programmatic way. Event propagations, we know that how the bubble or the compose works. Bubble means that whether it will traverse through the DOM hierarchy or not, right? And compose is used whether it will cross the shadow boundary or not. That's the difference between bubble and the compose. And communications across DOM, so we better to use lightning messages service, that is LMS. And there will also primitive is example, seems primitive way of doing this thing through the PubSub. Ultimately, it is works with the public subscriber model. So let's talk about that. What should we do to use payload for event target.dispatch event primitive data or the copy of data to the new object? Bubbles true and the compose true are not recommended as they bubble up to the entire DOM hierarchy across the shadow boundary. I'm giving an example that in my one of my experience, I was building a related list component. There are three components over there, nested components. One is a grandparent component, parent component, and the child component. Now, the requirement is the child component will raise an event that parent will not handle, grandparent will directly handle that. In that cases, I have used the bubbles true and compose true. Okay. But at the same time, when the parent is actually handling this event, we have stopped the propagating this event. Otherwise, it will go up to the shadow boundary. Okay. Consider using LMS over PubSub. Let's say if you have a requirement that we have the two separate discrete components are there in other pages, right? Not in the same pages, right? At that moment, you can think about using the LMS is a more sophisticated way of doing rather than PubSub. And don't forget to remove event listener in disconnected callback lifecycle. Finally, we'll talk about LWC security, and let's talk about that. What is inbuilt in LWC? We all know the LWC locker service, right? This LWC web securities actually replaces the lockers. So it enforces the strict mode. It also adheres the DOM access containment, blocking custom elements. It also prevents the eval for unsafe activities. And in the latest release, it is having better support for third-party library and access content in iframe. We also have an inbuilt security in LWC itself that is sanitizing the mal from HTML and blocking CSP incompatible code. I know that if you are working with the Experience Cloud, definitely you will face this kind of stuff for blocking of CSP. Okay. Now, what should it do to as a part of these recommendations? These recommendations is mainly applicable. I have seen that is the App Exchange product development. If you want to go for your security review, definitely we should adhere these kind of best practices. So use platform resource loader module to import any third-party JavaScript or CSS library. Never use Peak jack vulnerability. So never use position fixed or high Z index value or the negative values at margin. Otherwise, your security review will fail. Never use inline CSS in HTML. Restrict use of inner HTML, outer HTML, and prevent evil listener from leaking the memory. Here is one of the example where can be memory leak can be happened. So that's all for that's a few part I've talked about the securing of LWC. What are the tools are recommended to develop these LWC as well as security scanning? We know the ESLint. Secondly, that we can evaluate JavaScript in Lightning Web Security Console and look up distortion details in LWS distortion viewer. So that's all on the security part of it. And thank you so much for attending these sessions. Thank you all. Have a nice time. Bye.